Hey there, art nerds. Today I am really excited to share my MIYA field test with you guys. So intrepid viewers might remember that not too long ago I unboxed and swatched this particular MIYA palette, and I felt pretty positive about it. I really liked it and even compared it to the Meiliang palette. Now today I'm going to put it through its paces, we're going to really test it out, and we're going to use it to paint this watercolor illustration here. This is from Lilliputian Living Volume 3. It's kind of my yearly inking challenge that I do every October. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And if you love tiny people, if you love whimsy and fairy tales, if you love prose and charming illustrations, I think you guys will love the Compendium Stupendium Lilliputian Living, now in one volume. You can order it from the Natto shop, and I'll be sure to link it down in the description below. I will also have the show notes from today's field test for you guys in case you would prefer to read along. I'll have that down for y'all as well as some tutorials that you guys might find helpful, useful, and informative. And be sure to check the cards because I always link goodies there as well. So if you don't remember, this is footage from the original MIYA unbox and swatch. These watercolors have unusual diamond pans, a little bit larger than the Meiliang half pans, approximately the same size as a regular half pan, but not really the same format. These are student grade watercolors and they're about $20 on Amazon. In the unboxing swatch, I was really impressed. You get a lot of bold, vibrant color, and they don't require a lot of fighting and struggling to actually access that color. So I'm entering today's field test with high hopes and high expectations. I expect these to perform about as well as the Meiliang or the pretty excellent watercolors did. If you're interested and you'd like to see the full unbox and swatch review, I'll link that down in the description for you guys as well. So reviews like this are only made possible thanks to the amazing generosity of my patrons on Patreon. All materials are purchased out of pocket unless I disclose otherwise, and I always disclose otherwise. So if you enjoy reviews like this one, if you find them helpful, useful, and informative, if they help you make art a habit, I hope you'll join me over on Patreon. Today's field test is on Stonehenge Aqua cold press watercolor paper. This is the same paper that I use for the majority of my watercolor field tests these days, and it gives me a nice standard baseline for comparison. This is a paper that can take a lot of layers, it can take a lot of water, it's not overly expensive, and it's cotton rag, so it's gonna help the colors really shine through. However, if you add too much water to this paper, you do need to be patient and give it a chance to dry out thoroughly in order to get best results with future layers. So I am stretching this watercolor illustration. I'm using my favorite blue painter's tape for this. So we're not really looking to see if the watercolors cause any kind of buckling or anything like that. That's not something I've necessarily heard of, but I'm just trying to demonstrate to you guys that we have kind of a standard way, or I have kind of a standard way of reviewing watercolors, even student grade watercolors here on the channel. And that allows me to be able to compare my watercolors and give you guys recommendations, at least based on my taste and my use case. Speaking of taste and use case, I am a watercolor comic artist. I paint the watercolor comics 7" Kara. So if you enjoy comics, if you enjoy charming tales, if you enjoy watercolor, I really hope you guys will check it out. You can read it for free as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com, or you can buy volume 1 or volume 2 through the Natto shop. Help support the work that I do. I'll have links down in the description below if you guys are interested in that. But when I am reviewing watercolors in general, I am looking for watercolors that will work well for my needs as an illustrator and as a watercolor comic artist. And typically that leads me to professional grade watercolors rather than student grade watercolors because I just can't get the results I want out of most student grade brands. But frequently I've been trying to review more and more student grade watercolors because a lot of people who are interested in watercolor and are interested in watercolor for illustration can't really justify spending $60 or more for a starter watercolor set. And not that all professional watercolors cost that much, but that's a pretty good baseline for it. And there have been many brands releasing $20 fairly decent student grade watercolor palettes, like the Meiliang palette that I keep talking about here. And it just kind of changed my mind in some regards to how student grade watercolors handle, or at least what is possible for student grade watercolors at a price point that is way more accessible to more people. So I'm definitely going to be working more student grade watercolor reviews into my rotation, and I hope that's helpful for those of you who are interested in watercolor for illustration, who are interested in getting started with watercolor, but are not yet ready to sink that much money into something that you're not sure you'll really enjoy. So I'm starting this field test with a really light, cool yellow to kind of pre-tone this with a sunny vibe. And I feel like this takes a lot more paint to get the kind of saturation that I want. And this is pretty normal with student grade watercolors because they tend to have a lot of fillers. I pre-spritz my palette, but these paints activate quickly anyway. So you don't need to spritz and wait for them to soak up paint. You can spritz and start painting almost immediately if you want to. I think the selection of blues in this palette is really nice. You generally don't see this many blues in a student grade palette, and it includes some pretty different colors, and not just different because some are more pastel, like legitimately different blue hues. So that adds a lot of use to this palette, particularly if you like to paint nature scenes. And my goal with this is to mainly handle it like I would any other watercolor, but I'm going to denote when I change how I handle the paints because of the limitations of the paints or the limitations for student grade watercolors. So I do notice that lighter colors, i.e. lighter washes, less saturated washes, really don't pack much of a punch when you water them down. You lose a lot of that vibrancy and you lose a lot of your color. Now this is important because it's going to take a lot more paint to be able to mix the saturations you want. And I know some people think of just pastel when it comes to watercolor, but anybody who's kind of familiar with the work I paint know that I love a wide range of colors. I really love saturation, and I really like the ability to build up darker hues without necessarily using or spending a lot of paint to get there. So I do think you're going to run through this palette quickly, especially if you enjoy it much more quickly than you would with, say, the Meiliang palette or some of the other palettes that I've reviewed since reviewing this one, because I've got 3 student grade palettes for you guys coming up that I think you guys will enjoy. Now, when you do get the colors saturated enough, they're really pretty and they seem to layer nicely. But that said, it muddies the water fast, and it takes a fair amount of paint to get a half decent color. So one of the things you kind of notice if you watch your water is when you muddy your water really quickly, when you're constantly having to cycle through your water to get half clean water or full clean water, I guess, because you need that clean water to not paint a muddy watercolor illustration. But water that muddies quickly is usually a sign that there's a lot of optical brighteners and other fillers in your watercolor. And that kind of stretches out the watercolor. It makes it cheaper for the company. It means they can offer it at a lower price point, which sounds great, but it means you're getting less paint, and it's gonna mean you're gonna use more paint just to get the colors you want. So in the end, it's really not very economical for you, the customer, the artist, as it is for the company. I also noticed that color really globs up onto the brush, but it's kind of surprisingly weak once you mix it with water, and these might work better for direct painting techniques. The color globbing onto the brush is also an issue because it makes saturation and color control much more difficult than if you were to just pick up some color. It's one of those things that you kind of have to experience both to realize why the color globbing onto your brush is not such a good thing. And as I mentioned earlier, I have to change the water frequently because it muddies really fast, and I don't want the paints to turn muddy too. I want this illustration to be as brilliant and as saturated as possible. So I could definitely see someone going through this palette quickly, especially if you enjoy painting, because it takes a lot of paint to mix a decently saturated color, especially compared to professional grade watercolors, but even compared to other student grade watercolors like the Meiliang. The color looks like it would be saturated, and then it goes on really weak. So you should probably use a lot less water with these than you would if you were using professional grade watercolor or the Meiliang watercolors. And just then I did a wet into wet demonstration, and I just decided to be a little self-indulgent and include a very quick hyperlapse of the paint actually drying. I was hoping for a more striking wet into wet demonstration because with other brands you can usually get this really nice diffused wet into wet bloom, but these paints don't seem to really like wet into wet techniques, and we'll really get into that a little bit later on. So my goal with this is to establish a foreground leaf with a yellow undertone, a midground leaf with a green undertone, and a background leaf with a blue undertone. The colors go down pretty bright and saturated, but dry far less saturated. Honestly, for some colors, the color payoff is kind of disappointing. You really have to glob it on to get the color you're going for. It's kind of difficult to build up the color you want, especially if you aren't mixing colors or working super thick and globby. I'm using a nice cottonrag paper, the same one I use for all of my modern watercolor field tests, and it almost feels like a student grade paper because I just can't get the effects I want. The wet into wet dries really unimpressive. It takes so much paint to get any color at all. And then the Viridian is just so milky, it's really hard to get color payoff with it. You can tell it's milky too because it looks whitish as soon as you try to pick it up with a wet brush. Those optical brighteners are on full display. The colors, especially Viridian and Indigo, dry really patchy, and that's so frustrating because you can legit know what you're going for and how to paint it, and these will still mess that up for you. And that's something that I always want to warn you guys about. I always want to point out to you guys. There are so many people who have come and talked to me at cons, or they talk to me on Discord, or they talk to me in the comments, and they're frustrated with their watercolor because they can't quite achieve what they have in mind. And it's usually a failure of the paper, the paint, or both. And in this instance, I know it's a failure of the paint because I've used this paper for all my other field tests. I have a solid baseline for comparison. The Meiliang paints handle like better paints than they are, and these handle way worse than the Meiliang. I'd hope they'd be comparable and I could just recommend whichever was cheaper or suited your needs. I ended up painting over some areas several times just trying to cover up the patchiness, which is not something you want in watercolor. And it's really hard to do the techniques I did literally the day before with different paints. It's taking me longer to get the same sort of color punch and using up much more paint. I understand that this is student grade, but in a field test compared to the Meiliang pigments, I feel like these struggle to keep up and are much more likely to turn to mud, even when working with the same color triad. And I am used to watercolor drawing a bit more dull, a bit lighter, or less saturated than it was when it was wet. I mean, wet watercolor is just kind of magical. It has this scintillating jewel-like quality, and dry watercolor, loses a lot of that magic unless you really work at it. But the shift here is pretty significant, especially with colors that have a lot of water mixed into them. It's also a challenge to get wet into wet to work properly. To get enough color, you have to really pack it, but then it globs onto the brush and it won't diffuse as much as you'd like because there just isn't enough water, or it dries really patchy. This illustration should have been an easy piece for me. Literally before painting this, I painted an illustration of Kara sitting amongst the strawberries, so this should have been a cakewalk. But instead, it was kind of a struggle, and I found myself getting kind of frustrated, which is not what you want when you're painting. It's frustrating that a lot of the layering, like the indigo, just turns to mud on the page. At this point, it's really frustrating me, and I feel like I might be just overworking it trying to fix it. So once I finished painting the leaves, I went to bed, let it dry overnight, and came back to it fresh with the intention of moving on. And here's a demonstration of the color shift you get as the colors are drying. You can see they really lighten up a lot. So this is the second day of working on this field test, and my goal is not to paint a trash piece just so I can rag on some paints that I honestly really liked in the unboxing swatch. So honestly, this is super disappointing and frustrating for me. This is all just 100% how I'm feeling in the moment. I take notes as I do these, and then I narrate later on, and like as I'm watching this, I'm kind of reliving that frustration, and as I'm reading the notes, I can tell how frustrated I was with this piece. I don't really enjoy just ragging on art supplies anymore. I prefer to focus on art supplies I really like and being able to recommend them to people. So it's kind of disappointing to me that these are just not doing what I want them to do. So my goal is to do my best to lean into their strong points and create something cute that I could be proud of, and using all of the salvage techniques I know. And I have reviewed some real garbage watercolors and real garbage art supplies in the past, so I do know some salvage techniques. But the MIYA watercolors make the paint, oh, hold on. Sorry, I lost myself. So even after drying all night, colors that should be fairly set and immovable to end up reactivating and moving around, which leads to mud if you're trying to do glazes. Now, generally, if I allow watercolors to dry fully overnight, unless they're just very prone to lifting, like really opaque watercolors, they're going to be on there. You can paint on top of them as long as you're careful. But these reactivate like I didn't let them dry at all. And it makes the paint difficult to control and predict, and you end up with a very sloppy painting, even if you know what you're doing, which is, oh, it makes me so sad, because I am sure there are artists who can make beautiful things with these paints, but I know there's also going to be a lot of younger artists, a lot of artists with less experience with watercolor who are going to see those artists make beautiful art with it and think that they should be able to do the same and not be able to, because they don't know all the ways you can salvage bad watercolors. So I just feel bad for them, and I hope they'll end up with the Meiliang palette or one of the other palettes that I have coming up in the near future, because those are going to make them so much happier than the MIYA palette. These are definitely kind of frustrating to use, and I haven't even started painting the kids yet, which is going to be the most challenging part. The hot pink is also kind of milky and a bit weak. You do get more paint than the Meiliang palette, but it's really stretched out with fillers. The paint itself is also a bit more gloppy, making it harder to use and harder to apply, more difficult to control. I really wanted to like this palette, and I'm really sad that it's been such a frustration to paint with. At the end of the video, I'm going to compare this palette with the Meiliang palette, and I'm going to compare the Fieldtest against the Meiliang Fieldtest as well, and come back to y'all with my revised opinions of which one that I'd recommend. So starting the skin tones is definitely going to be scary, because these are these are darker skinned kids, and these paints do not like watering down or layering or lighter applications to build up color, so I really don't know how well this is going to turn out. It's a great test for the paints, because I feel like you should be able to mix any skin color you need from a palette this size, but I hate making ugly art due to the limitations of the products. So I've pulled out a bit so you can see which colors I'm using. And I am going to use a lot of hyperlapses to demonstrate how color goes down one way and then tends to dry lighter. So hopefully that'll give you guys a good idea of what we're dealing with today. And I've noticed that the colors are very quick to fall out of solution when you've mixed them, which is not great if you're mixing skin tones. And even if you're applying color to a fully dry area, it's super prone to bleeding. I've noticed this with student grade watercolor with a lot of optical brighteners. It's like it forms a second ground on the paper. So you guys can see how much lighter it dries. This is so frustrating when mixing skin tones. It makes it much more challenging to use. So I'm going to take a little bit of a break from complaining about these watercolors and just kind of talk to you guys about what I'm doing here. So I'm trying to build up some more saturation in the leaves so that we can get a bit more contrast. I'm using basically full strength indigo to try and paint in some more shadow and some more depth so that we can get some more contrast in between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background leaves. This is also going to help create a bit more of a sense of depth in this illustration. I'm also going to go in and kind of clean up some of the veins on the leaves, but with where we've gotten with this, it's too messy to try and paint on top of it and really clean things up too much. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to re-ink a little bit just to add some additional clarity later on, and I'm also going to use some white gouache to pull in some highlights that are going to help clean things up a bit as well. After painting the leaves and most of the strawberries, I've also realized that I really can't do anything too complicated with these watercolors. These watercolors can't handle most basic watercolor techniques. So it's important that I just kind of keep things simple, not overwork them too much, and don't push these watercolors too far. Doing the layers on the skin tone is a little bit nerve-wracking. I have to be really careful not to lift up the prior layers, and I also have to remix the color every time because it falls out of solution so quickly. I was really hoping that this would turn out to be a really cute illustration because I really liked the inks and I had a clear vision of what I wanted this to look like, but you know, that's what happens when you're reviewing watercolors and you're field testing them. Sometimes you just get thrown a weird curveball because I really like these in the unboxing swatch. I thought these were going to be great, and I know other artists who like these watercolors, but for me, they're just not it. If you like the MIYA palette and there's like a specific case, like you're using them for brush lettering, or you're weird like me and you painted a bunch of eggs with them, I did that with the Meiliang palette, and they're really good for that, let me know down in the comments and leave a link to your work because I'd love to check it out. But these are kind of a struggle for me. This illustration has definitely been a challenge because all the techniques I'd normally rely on just don't work or are a huge risk. Sometimes they work, sometimes not. What is in my favor is that it's not humid when I'm painting this. If it was still open and prone to moving, it'd be even harder to work with. For darker skin tones, the colors are kind of muddy and heavy. This is not a palette I'd recommend for painting a variety of people. These have a fair amount of muddiness and opacity to them, so of course, at the end, I'm gonna have to re-ink them. Now, one thing I do like is that I have a lot of colors at the ready. If you use them at full saturation, like I'm doing here with this blue, colors that are fairly vibrant. This could be a good palette for people who are doing brush lettering or maybe some card making where they're not looking to mix a lot of color, and they don't need to mix a lot of color. There's a lot of colors in this palette. I believe this is a 36 half pan set, similar to the Meiliang palette. So you do get a wide variety of blues, greens, yellows, reds, pinks, and even a fair number of neutrals and earth tones, which could be really helpful. If you have a different art style than I do, if you're not going to be doing a lot of mixing, a lot of layering, a lot of blending, a lot of wet into wet, this could be a good option for you. But I do want to warn you about all the areas this palette just falls short in, because if you're looking for a good all-round palette, this one isn't it. There are better ways to spend your $20, and I'm happy to recommend other palettes that are going to make you a lot happier and that are going to give you better results with your watercolor illustrations. Initially, I'd had really high hopes for this palette because I know MIYA also makes those jelly gouaches that people have so much fun with. No, they're not professional quality gouache, but I see people using them all the time and it looks like so much fun, and I gave in and ordered a set because I'd like to do that too. It looks like fun, and honestly, I'm going to reserve judgment on that set. I haven't had a chance to unbox it and swatch it and take a look at it and play with it on black paper, which is what I'd like to use it on. So I'm hoping that's still awesome because people really like those, and that this is just not it, not really the best. I think MIYA is capable of more and capable of better. They do have other watercolor palettes, but those seem to be aimed more at kids. Some of them are more like tempera, and some of them seem more like glycerin-based watercolors like we see with Crayola. So I'm not really interested in taking a look at those, but I had hoped that considering their gouache is so well received, this palette would also be really good. So earlier I mentioned that I'd have to re-ink with this. So generally with these kind of watercolor illustrations, I do a bit of re-inking anyway, because even with professional grade watercolors, you are going to get some colors that are more opaque than others. But with this piece, I had to re-ink. There was so much opacity. These added so much just muddiness to the illustration that I had to re-ink. And I'm also using white gouache, and I always use white gouache, but I'm really leaning on the white gouache this time to help clean things up, to add a little bit of cohesion, and to make it look more intentional and a little more polished than the end result ended up being. The illustration's okay. It's definitely not my best. It really should have been better. If the paints had been better, I think it would have been a stronger illustration. But what really gets me is that these paints fought me the whole time, and I've been painting for about 10 years now, and I paint almost every day, and I had a lot of trouble getting the best out of these paints. So with the Meiliang field test, I got kind of absorbed into painting. I hit hyperfocus. With the MIYA watercolors, I have a lot to say because, well, I kept fighting these watercolors and didn't get into flow until near the end. Honestly, these paints were annoying and frustrating for me. And it's kind of a shame to use this palette on this illustration because the inks were so cute. So, in case you don't have the best memory in the world, I included some shots from my original Meiliang unbox and swatch. So this is what the Meiliang palette looks like. It comes in a metal tin, the half pans are much smaller, and these are some shots from the Meiliang field test. I really like these paints. These paints kind of changed my opinion on what student grade watercolors can and should be. These are produced by the same company that manufactures the Paul Rubens watercolors, and I think these are a great introduction to watercolor. Yes, they include some optical brighteners. Yes, you're going to move through the paints a bit faster, but you can layer, you can mix, you can do beautiful, delicate wet into wet techniques. So these have become kind of my standard for comparing other student grade watercolors against. So I really like the Meiliang palette, and I hope you guys, if you're interested, you'll check out my unboxing swatch review and field test for that, because I have a lot of great things to say about that palette, and I'm able to demonstrate a lot of techniques. So MIYA versus Meiliang. The Meiliang palette has smaller pans, similar amount of colors. Colors contain fewer optical brighteners and will last longer. The colors mix well, the colors layer well, and the colors handle like more expensive watercolors. The MIYA palette has lots of optical brighteners and they muddy the water fast. The colors fall out of mixed solutions very quickly. The colors turn muddy quickly as well. You can't really do many traditional watercolor techniques with these. Wet into wet is basically a toss-up. Color saturation, especially in mixes, is just weak and muddy. Compared to Meiliang, these are frankly quite disappointing. I expected a lot better. Comparing the two side by side, I think the differences are really apparent. The Meiliang, that's on the left, has bright, vibrant, fairly clean colors. They played well on the cottonrag paper, and I was able to mix up a clean mid-tone skin tone that doesn't look muddy or goopy. These were easy to work with, mixed well, layered well, and are generally a joy for the price and something I'd happily recommend. The MIYA on the right is muddy and patchy. The colors aren't particularly clean or vibrant, and the paints sort of fought the cottonrag paper. The darker skin tones read as muddy, although I used similar techniques to the Meiliang field test. The colors did not layer well, and I had to constantly change out the water to make sure I wasn't painting with mud. The differences are night and day. The Meiliang were fun to paint with, the MIYA were frustrating. I would recommend the Meiliang over the MIYA any day now. The results and the handling really speak volumes. What's frustrating, but honestly great for the purposes of a fair review, is that I used the same paper, Stonehenge Aqua, the same brushes, silver black velvet, and the same types of palettes, mainly ceramic, a similar time frame, and many of the same techniques, but to me, the results are pretty drastic. While the twins are cute, I know they'd be way cuter with a higher quality watercolor, or Meiliang, and while the Wild Rose Girl is in my portfolio that I showed to classes, unfortunately, the twins will never be in one, because it's really down to how the paints themselves handled. This is why I do field tests. Sometimes it can look great in swatches, and then perform poorly when put to a real-world use, and I want to create reviews that actually help you guys buy art supplies you'll love. So the pros and cons for the MIYA palette. The pros. The price, very inexpensive, about $20. The compact format could travel quite easily, although it doesn't really include any mixing surfaces on it, so you're going to need to bring that. You do have larger pans, so you can use a larger brush. This is something I had trouble with the Meiliang palette. You have a wide color gamut, so you're not going to have to do a lot of color mixing, and these reactivate from a ceramic mixing palette decently well. The cons? The color payoff is hit or miss. Some colors are really weak unless used at full strength. The colors are prone to reactivating and bleeding, which is a frustration. It's almost impossible to pull off normal watercolor techniques that I should be able to do on cotton rag paper. I want you guys to be able to compare for yourselves. So I'm going to include some shots here that are closer up, that kind of scroll through. So hopefully you guys can see some of the areas where I succeeded and some of the areas where I struggled, and be your own judge. I am not telling you directly which one to buy. I can recommend that you go with the Meiliang palette, but in the end, the choice is yours. I just hope that whichever palette you go with, you're happy. It's probably pretty obvious to you guys what my verdict is going to be for the MIYA watercolors. It's so much harder to paint a nicer piece with these. It takes longer, and even if you're using nice materials, the end piece won't look as good as it should, and it feels more like a student piece compared to a piece that was also painted with a student grade watercolor. This is a perfect example of how using student grade materials can often hinder your art from being as good as it could be. There are definitely some good student grade or budget watercolors out there, and I've reviewed a bunch of them, like Mozart's Komorebi, the Meiliang Pigment's pretty excellent watercolors, but these kind of exemplify why I generally recommend against student grade watercolors. I had high hopes for this piece based off the swatches and my experience using the Meiliang palette, but field testing them and creating a full illustration that used a variety of techniques helped me form a very different opinion. I would recommend you skip the MIYA palette. If you're looking for an approximately $20 multicolor, like wide array of colors palette, I would recommend you go with the Meiliang palette. They're smaller half pans, but they're better half pans. And they're made by the same company that's producing Paul Rubens watercolors. So if you like Meiliang watercolors, you're probably gonna like the Paul Rubens watercolors. I've reviewed both. At some point in the future, if you guys are interested, I'll do a head-to-head comparison comparing the Meiliang student grade watercolors against the Paul Rubens professional grade watercolors. But I think they're a great complement. I think they lead naturally into the Paul Rubens lineup, and I'd like to see more retailers here in the US kind of showcase that graduation. The MIYA palette, this is the end of the road. This is the nicest palette of watercolors that MIYA makes, as far as I know, as far as I've been able to ascertain when researching the MIYA palette. So there isn't something better that I could try that I might like more. This is it. So I would recommend skipping the MIYA watercolor palette. I'm still interested in trying out those jelly gouaches, and I hope you guys will be interested in what I have to say about them. I will caveat, I am not a gouache person. I mostly got them because I thought that they looked accessible and fun, and there's a lot I like about gouache, and there's a lot I don't like about gouache, and the jelly gouache kind of addresses what I don't like about it. So I still have high hopes for those, but I would recommend you guys snooze on the MIYA palette. Despite my grievances with this palette, I had a blast reviewing these watercolors, and I hope you guys enjoyed this, or I hope it was at least helpful and inspiring for you guys. If you enjoyed it, let me know. Leave me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, and maybe share this with somebody who's thinking about buying some watercolors and they're not really sure what to get. Maybe they're strongly considering the MIYA watercolors. This palette was purchased out of pocket using my funds and funds raised through my Patreon, so all opinions are my own, and they're based on my years of experience teaching reviewing watercolor and other art supplies, and creating watercolor comics. They're also kind of based on my experiences pursuing an MFA in sequential art at SCAD. So hopefully this was helpful for you, but it is totally cool if you have a very different opinion and you happen to love these watercolors. I am absolutely not at all dissing you. I'm just dissing this palette. But hopefully this was helpful, useful, and informative for you guys, and hopefully this will help you guys make art a habit. If there are any other student grade or professional grade watercolors that you're interested in that I haven't reviewed, let me know in the comments below as well. And a huge, massive thank you to these amazing patrons here. This video would not be possible without them. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.